Welcome back. If you watched my last video, you've gone out and bought yourself a whole lot of stuff and are now eagerly awaiting your first painted model. Before you get to painting, however, we need to first prime the surface to receive paint. Priming is usually thought of as a single step, but it's everything that we're doing to set up the painting. Most of that is in the removal of manufacturing artifacts and setting the surface up to be painted. As 99% of modern miniatures are made in mass, some trace of their creation will be present in the final sculpt. These bits gotta go, as they will impact the painting process. Worse than that, they remove the invisibility of the miniature. I refer to the sense of verisimilitude that they present as warriors of the far future, dungeon raiding hobos, or anything in between. It's kinda hard to be absorbed by them when globs of paint have collected on mold lines or when gaping holes in them remind you that you're ultimately looking at a little piece of plastic. I mean, it's hard to be absorbed by them when they look like that one guy from RoboCop who got splashed with toxic waste in the finale, but that's fairly obvious. It's hard to show this on a tiny model, so to illustrate my talking points, and to make this that much easier to explain, we'll look at these principles on a larger sculpture. Melissa, Demon of the Frozen Forest by Katarzyna Gorska. Great painter, by the way. Love you, Kaha. There are a number of potential flaws a sculpt can have, but two are most common: mold lines and gaps. A mold line is where two segments of a mold come together and a tiny amount of the casting material, in this case resin, leaches out. These can be minimal in the case of plastic from Games Workshop, or significant in the case of resin from Games Workshop. Small mold lines can be easily scraped away with a knife by dragging the edge across the surface perpendicularly. A basic blade can do most of this, but other shapes like a carving blade can be beneficial. A large curve allows you to do a variety of different motions. This scraping, however, is usually enough. While tempting, it's best to avoid doing any carving or digging into the sculpt. It's very easy to dig in too sharply into the material and carve something important out. One frustrating aspect of bus is getting a good alignment for the supporting rod. You want the rod centered and straight, but that's not always easy to do with a handheld drill. In my case, I use a cheap-ass drill press and a vise to align everything. Since resin is softer than steel, I blunt the vise with some XPS foam so I can tighten everything down without damaging the sculpt. Then, you only need to align the sculpt properly and dive in to get a perfect hole. Of course, it helps when you're not actually trying to film your work and set things up correctly. When correcting mold lines, it's best to fix your parts individually so you may approach them from any angle necessary. But since gaps only appear when you start putting things together, you'll have to accept that some work is going to be pushed down the line. Gaps come in a variety of dimensions. For small ones, I use Vallejo white stone to fill them. This is a water-soluble acrylic emulsion of marble dust that can help fill in voids. It's a bit fragile and requires a couple coats to actually fix things, but its ease of use means I keep it around. You just need an old brush to apply with. Note that this is only really useful when said gaps are small. Large gaps will demand putty, but that's later. In modeling, it's a pain in the side to wait for your materials to dry so you can get on with whatever it is you're doing. So investing into a heat gun of some sort is a good use of money. You can also use a hairdryer, which does have advantages. Since evaporation occurs mostly through convection, it will work faster than a heat gun for drying purposes, which doesn't put out as much air. However, the heat gun can go far hotter, which allows you to soften resin for reshaping. This is useful, but mind the heat level lest you literally melt your model. To fix this hole, I need to employ some putty. There are many out there, but most common ones are green stuff and milliput, which I conveniently have neither of. What do you expect? I'm a broke-ass artist, and when I went to LVO last October, I lent somebody all my putty and they used the entire box, and I haven't had the money to go get more. That being said, they all work the same. One part is a resin, the other a hardener. Mix equal parts by volume, and then stuff into place. The main difference is their solvent and the hardness once dried. Some modeling tools can help get the stuff where you want it. Here, though, I just stuff the hole and make it smooth with a knife. We'll get to other tricks another day. What do you do with leftover putty, you may ask? Simple, you fashion it into a disc, and then you can use it for later projects. You could also make rocks, slabs, all sorts of stuff that can be used for future basing, but that's another video. Remember those primers I mentioned in the last video? This is where they come in. Rattle can priming is where we're going to start. Grab yourself a box and hope to God it isn't raining outside. I live in the Pacific Northwest, so that gives me basically half of 6 months of the year that I can use these things with. Thankfully, it's an uncharacteristically good January day outside, so let's go out there and do this. Your primer has to be somewhat warm, about 80 degrees to spray correctly. Your outside conditions can basically be whatever, provided that it's not stupidly hot or cold, and provided it's not humid. Humidity completely screws up rattle can priming. If you live in Florida or something, first off, I apologize. Second off, bring your model into a garage or something, cause it ain't working out in the bayou. Assuming your can is warm, shake the absolute Christ out of it. Seriously, you cannot mix this stuff enough, and keep doing so throughout the process. Start priming by spraying off the model, then move on to it. You want to stay close, but not too close to the model. If you're too far away, the primer has a chance to dry and may leave texture on it. If you're too close, you will overwhelm the model and you have no control. My rule of thumb is 1 full can distance away, but as you can see, you can get closer if you have a weaker can. The issue is that the straw that sucks up the aerosol has unmixed paint in it, and this initial blast can leave blobs of primer on your sculpt and overwhelm detail. You will need to figure out how high the pressure is so you can tell how far away you should be. A full can that's brand new with lots of pressure needs more distance than this one, which is weaker. After you clear the line, I've found that you can spray spots of primer as you need them. Once the model is primed, let it off gas for about 20 minutes or so. When you bring your model inside and look at it, you will probably see a lot of new flaws that you missed the first time around.
Don't you feel silly? Don't you feel stupid? Don't you feel a little ashamed?
This is normal. With matte finishes comes a greater level of readability and visual information that allows these imperfections to actually be noticed. You just have to go in and fix these flaws now that you can see them. After that, you can reprime or just paint over it with a similar color if you don't have to fix a massive area that you scraped away. Part of the reason I like iron oxide so much as a primer is that it's very easy to fix with the same paint, and for color reasons that we'll eventually get to. This piece is now ready to go. We'll come back to this one in time. For now, to keep you comfortable, we'll paint at a scale and subject that everybody loves. Space Marines. I prepared these ones beforehand. When you start out, it's more than likely that you're going to be using a dry palette, such as a plate, to hold everything with. This is fine to begin with, and there are some advantages to be had by it, but there are 2 significant issues. Firstly, acrylic has a very short open time of dry palettes. In my experience, you only have about 15 to 20 minutes of solid working time before the paint starts to seize up. That seems long, but that means you have to work very quickly, not generally the best environment for learning. You will also have to keep adding paint in order to compensate for this. This won't seem like a huge problem in the beginning, but this constant back and forthing impedes you. You need more time to think and the ability to manipulate your materials. You'll also burn through your supplies very quickly by doing this. Remember the parchment paper, paper towels, and tray you got from the grocery store? Well, this is where they come to play now. The wet palette is a modern solution to a modern problem. By setting your paint onto semi-permeable parchment paper, itself over a wet surface, some minor amount of water can leach into your paint, allowing it to stay open while you work. This is not a miracle cure. The paint does eventually change its behavior and may require an occasional re-upping as it absorbs water, but it beats the constant reaching for paint every 5 minutes. My wet palette consists of a half-sheet pan with a large flat sponge. You could easily make your own out of a flat plastic tray and paper towels, but I like the space and the convenience that parchment paper has that's cut to size. It may seem like overkill to have a palette this large for a project that's this small, but I swear it's worth it. A tiny 6x8 Tupperware that you buy from the game store can work for little projects, but it's a serious drag on anything that's more involved. Your palette houses all your paint and any manipulation that you're going to perform with it, which means the more space you have, the more you can do. Look at Bob Ross here. If Daddy Bob was using something this large for canvas, then it has to be a good idea. In addition, tiny mixtures have short lifespans and quickly dry out or become ineffective. A larger palette allows for a larger mixture. This palette is admittedly a little big, but the 6x8 Tupperware that you bought from the game store is not it, chief. All you need is a lid of some sort. And this can be anything, but a piece of corrugated plastic I found is perfect. Ask a local sign shop for their scrap and they'll gladly give you some. There are innumerable ways to paint, but for the purposes of getting a hold of things, I will explain to you the most common method. The basic gamer method. The heavy metal style. Oh, excuse me. The heavy metal style. This was made up by Games Workshop back in the late 80s in order to allow newcomers who had no art experience paint something relatively decent so they could come back in and buy more miniatures. Many people have tried and continue to use this methodology, and, hot take, I think it's really useful for learning basic painting techniques. But that's just it. Basic painting techniques. There's a lot more to painting than base coating, washing, and edge highlighting, described soon, as we will get to in time. But from the perspective of somebody who's just picking up the brush, you're probably looking to make something that doesn't look like a creature you've seen off of some sort of Datura strip. And this methodology can do that for you. However, my goal is to set you on a painting journey that will lead to a solid foundation of understanding, not just give you a list of products to purchase and parroting common advice. There are 3 fundamental steps to the heavy metal style. First, we'll color all the various parts of a simple flat tone. We'll then overwhelm the surface of a darker shade of that color to create relief shadows within the sculpt. Then we'll outline all the parts of a lighter color that allows for a greater degree of visual readability. That's the theory. So let's do that. The typical approach to miniature painting is to use a systemized progression of colors for various purposes. That's a valid way to paint, and certainly a lot easier to create tutorial PDFs with, but I believe that you're smart enough to handle 3 colors. And here they are: red, yellow, and blue for our first outing in painting, as well as white and black, which are freebies that can be included in everything. White is especially important, and a good one should be looked for as soon as possible. In this case, we're going to use a warm white since the store didn't have anything pure, but it will work for now. Our first step is to base our model. For this, we'll grab a fairly large brush, somewhere in the lines of a 4 to 6 so we can load up a fair amount of paint without having to constantly re-up. Then, we'll put our paint down on the palette. It's a good idea to put your paint in the margins to allow for maximum real estate in mixing and manipulation, as well as to put down a good deal of paint so we don't have to constantly add more. The first hurdle is to paint without the creation of undesired texture on your model. No doubt you've seen pictures of this flaw if you've been in the community for any length of time. This is a relatively simple fix. If we look to the style, the advice is to add some water. Easy. First, we'll wet our brush a bit, remove excess water, and we'll add some water to our paint. Wrong! Look, I know everyone and their dad is adding water to their paint these days, but think, Mark! The desire to add water to your paint comes because you're scared of creating texture on your models. I get it, it's the most common error a beginner painter makes. This is the source of many crappy paint jobs and dank memes on the internet. It has garnered our famous shibboleth: thin your paints and too thin coats. This is reasonable advice for beginners who, in a desire to cover their surface of their work opaquely, apply very heavy amounts of paint. But this pendulum has swung over into a new problem, and I am inherently suspicious of any paradigmatic without some degree of examination. If the goal is to create a uniform layer of color of your brushstrokes, then you want your paint to possess coverage. You want it to mark the surface evenly. And you want it to be opaque, so the base color you're painting over is obfuscated. And you want it to actually flow out your brush without the stroke breaking after 5mm. This last feature is not often realized by beginners, but is subconsciously understood as an annoyance. When you add water to your paint, you do reduce the viscosity, which leads to a flatter finish. But you've done 3 other things to it as well. You simultaneously increased its transparency, you moderately improved its flow, and you altered its dry time. The reduction of paint's viscosity may have improved its flattening ability, but you've actively harmed its coverage and opacity due to the increased presence of clear stuff. aka water. In other words, you've increased the transparency. If the goal is to create a transition from one area to the next, that could be beneficial, but it actively works against you when your goal is to create a flat, uniform layer of color. You may think then that in order to make the paint flow, you need to include water. To some extent this is true. Water does possess some flow improving properties, but this improvement is short-lived, both in the duration of time and the distance of the brushstroke. For tiny zones like a face, water could be beneficial, but over larger areas, it doesn't work out well. Oftentimes, by the point you're halfway through something like a cape, the water has begun to dry and you're back to where you started. With more water comes also an alteration of dry time. If it's very dry out, water will make your paint dry faster, as the dilutant can more readily evaporate. If it's humid, it will dry slower, as there is less opportunity for it to leave the surface. I can't speak as to where you live, but consider how this might impact your painting style. When you're setting up a flat base to work off of, you don't want to be using much water at all. You need the brush to be damp to function, but it shouldn't be glistening with water when you go to pick up paint after you wash it. Consider that paint manufacturers intend for their products to be used without dilution. That alone should say something about the way they intend for their stuff to be used. What results from this overemphasis on thinning paint is an hour anxiously applying dirty paint water to your work and fear that you could potentially obscure something like the model's pores. Painting with patches of dirty paint water is a valid methodology when you're refining. Albert Moretto Font does it, and he's perhaps the smoothest painter out there, but it would be madness to consider doing this for the initial stages. I'm being a bit hyperbolic here, but seriously, the overemphasis on diluting paint is as much a problem as not doing so. So what are we to do? We could add a flow improver or medium, which has a better benefit than water does, but we're still impacting the coverage by including the clear stuff. This is where those inks can come into play. This is liquid paint that actually has color in it. While a lot of inks are transparent, they are less impactful on the coverage than water is, while improving flow. So, let's mix some ink into our paint. We're looking for a melty ice cream consistency. Now let's base our model. When painting a base coat, it's a good idea to follow the edges of your paint. One significant feature of generating texture is the reactivation of paint that is already drying. Many beginners, if the paint isn't covering the surface well, will kind of pat away at their surface, trying to get an even layer. This risks drying or pulling up semi-dry paint, so a far better approach is to let it dry and then go over it once it's set. The two thin coats mentality. Resist the urge to fix it here. I said, resist the urge to fix it here. Resist! Some colors have poor opacity or coverage and do not take well to being painted over a dark base, such as yellow, a notoriously frustrating color that has high coverage but ass opacity, which usually necessitates a light base to paint it over with. Many pigments in fact have low opacity and will not obfuscate whatever is beneath them. You can get around this by integrating a color that has high coverage, high opacity, or both. This is functionally what most model brands do to their colors, usually with the inclusion of black or white pigments, which contain both high coverage or high opacity. A light color like yellow usually requires a light base to be put over, or to have a more opaque color mixed in and then covered with the original. This color, like demonic yellow, is actually yellow mixed with white, and you will see that in the future as we use more colors. With every component of the sculpt based with a flat tone, the next step is the wash. Here, we're going to take our base tones, darken them, and dilute them with water, then distribute it evenly across the surface of each part to create relief shadows with the sculpt's depressions and protrusions, as the wash settles in. Washes are a major stepping stone of improving modeling for many, as they can take the flatness so common to beginner work and add some depth to it. But this can also lead to problems if you're not careful. The biggest issue is that the wash can dry unevenly over flat areas, which leads to a very spotty coverage. The solution to this is a tad bit of acrylic medium, which allows the pigment not to break and move into the edges of the wash when drying. This, along with glazes, is the really only time that mediums are of any significant benefit to us. Ink has the issue of being a little too satin or glossy when thinned this way, though it could work for certain effects. Washes can be made from any color, but a common one people use is black. Nuln oil from Games Workshop is often referred to as liquid talent, but really it's little more than black mixed with water and medium, then sold to you for money. A black wash does create more depth, but black is boring and thus not the best choice. For every tone you base your parts with, you can simply add black in order to create a darker version, then dilute with water until you get a good consistency. At this point in time, extra complexity in color is not necessary. This will require some experimentation as there is too many variables to state the exact recipe with, so try your hand at adding more or less water or medium and see how you like the look. Finally, we will edge highlight the boundaries of the sculpt. This is mostly an exercise in patience and brush angle. You want your player to paint using the main body of the brush, not the tip, to catch protrusions. Going in directly with the tip is very prone to shift around and create blobs of paint, so consider not doing that. Paint dilution and control is quite important here. If the paint is a bit too fluid, it is likely to slide around and blob on the edges of forms. Too dry, and won't distribute evenly. You may need to add a bit of fresh paint here for the best result and experiment with different dilution levels. Games Workshop also likes to edge highlight every part of their model, but I am here to say that that's actually not as important as they emphasize. You can get a nice effect this way, as the system is very rewarding to have every single thing edge highlighted. But seriously, this is painstaking work and boring as well, so I recommend you highlight the areas that you find to be very important, whatever that is. Also, don't forget to have fun. This is the final result. This is an effective, simple way to achieve a reasonable finish on a miniature, but it does have flaws. While base coating, washing, and edge highlighting are all used in modeling, 3-tex is a very limited set of skills, and so the style finds it necessary to staple on peripherals, such as glazing and designs, in order to be interesting. It is also a very stylistic approach that, while effective, does have some limited application outside of very sharp models. Sure, on the Space Marine it works, but what about a more organic form like a basic human, or a slime that doesn't have distinct edges? This methodology has to supplement in more and more texts like glazing, but never really goes into depth as to why or when to use them. This is where artistic fundamentals come into play. If you're curious to learn what these are, stick around and subscribe. I am very desperate for outside validation. Like if you want to, or not. Take care now.